Willow Creek was a neighborhood that prided itself on perfection, where every lawn was manicured, every mailbox painted the correct shade of beige, and every homeowner was expected to follow a strict list of rules dictated by the HOA. It was a place where conformity wasn't optional, it was demanded. But in the shadows of this pristine suburban life lurked Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, whose sharp eye for minor deviations had earned her the reputation of a walking rulebook with a relentless personality. The trouble began on an ordinary Saturday morning, when a homeowner, recently moved into the community, decided to install a small fence along the side of their property. It wasn't tall, it wasn't obtrusive, and it certainly didn't impede anyone's view. It was functional, neat, and well-constructed. A simple barrier to protect a garden and define the property line. To any reasonable person, the fence was harmless. But to Karen, it was a symbol of rebellion, a direct violation of the orderly image she had spent years enforcing. Before long, Karen was documenting every inch of the new fence. She took photos from multiple angles, zoomed in on each post, and measured the distance between the fence and the curb, the sidewalk, and neighboring properties. In her mind, every inch that deviated from her personal standard was a violation. She compiled her findings into a formal complaint, emphasizing the supposed disruption of the neighborhood aesthetic and the potential negative impact on property values. Her emails to the HOA were long, dramatic, and meticulously detailed, creating the impression of a crisis that did not, in reality, exist. The homeowner received the notice a few days later. The letter was thinly veiled in bureaucratic language, citing vague clauses about visual consistency and community standards, but offering no concrete legal basis to remove the fence. The tone of the letter was firm, implying that the HOA expected compliance immediately, yet it also contained enough ambiguity to frustrate anyone trying to determine exactly what rule had been violated. For the homeowner, the first response was shock. It seemed impossible that such a minor, reasonable addition could provoke this level of outrage. But within that shock arose a spark of determination. Rather than responding impulsively or removing the fence, the homeowner began to study the HOA rules in exhaustive detail. Every clause, every bylaw, every obscure regulation was analyzed. This was not done out of mere curiosity, it was a strategic assessment. They wanted to know exactly what the HOA could enforce and, more importantly, what it could not. Hours turned into days as surveys, property maps, and legal documents were scrutinized. And then, in the fine print of the HOA regulations, a loophole appeared. An unassuming clause that allowed homeowners to make additions to their property provided they did not obstruct fire lanes, sidewalks, or utility easements. The fence was fully compliant with this clause. But the homeowner didn't stop there. They saw an opportunity to not just comply, but to turn the situation into a lesson in clever defiance. If the HOA wanted to nitpick minor details, then why not exploit the rules in a way that they could not legally challenge? If Karen wanted to enforce her own vision of perfection, then perhaps it was time to show the limits of her influence. What started as a simple fence could become a demonstration of strategic mastery, an example of how understanding the law could neutralize even the most obsessive HOA enforcer. Meanwhile, Karen's vigilance intensified. She began visiting neighbors, pointing out the fence as a violation of the community code, painting it as a threat to everyone's property values. She measured, she photographed, she whispered rumors. She even spoke directly to the board members of the HOA, insisting on immediate action. The board, however, was cautious. They had seen many of Karen's complaints in the past, each escalating slightly, yet always unsubstantiated. They hesitated, unsure whether this was an enforceable infraction or just another overzealous campaign. Their delay only fueled Karen's frustration, but it also provided the homeowner with precious time to prepare their next move. The homeowner began mapping out the property lines in meticulous detail. Every corner, every edge, every inch of legal territory was measured. They identified the maximum area in which the fence could legally extend, taking care to remain completely compliant with all HOA regulations. It was a masterful blend of caution and boldness, fully legal, yet designed to push Karen to the edge of her patience. The fence would not merely exist. It would expand in a way that challenged Karen's sense of control, revealing the limitations of both her authority and the HOA's enforcement power. As the days passed, tension in the neighborhood grew. Neighbors noticed Karen standing near her window, fuming over a fence that had existed for less than a week. Some whispered to each other, secretly amused by her obsession, while others quietly observed, curious to see how the conflict would unfold. The homeowner, by contrast, maintained a calm and almost invisible presence, giving no hint of the elaborate plan being set into motion. To the casual observer, life continued normally. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet war was brewing, one that would soon escalate beyond anything the HOA had anticipated. And then the morning came. The homeowner, fully prepared and armed with precise measurements, began the expansion. Each section of fence was carefully placed to maximize legal compliance while amplifying the psychological impact on Karen. By the end of the day, the fence had grown in a way that was technically allowed by the HOA, yet boldly encroached into areas Karen had assumed she could dictate. It was subtle, clever, and devastatingly effective. A display of strategic patience and careful planning that turned the tables in a single move. When Karen saw the expanded fence later that afternoon, her reaction was instantaneous. Shock, disbelief, and fury coursed through her. Every note, every photo, every complaint she had prepared seemed irrelevant. The HOA board could do nothing without violating their own rules. Her obsession, her control, her imagined authority. None of it could counter what had been executed so meticulously. The neighborhood began to notice her agitation, whispers spreading as residents observed the drama unfold. The fence had transformed from a simple barrier into a symbol of calculated defiance, and Karen had no recourse. The homeowner, meanwhile, watched the unfolding chaos with quiet satisfaction. Everything had gone according to plan. The fence stood perfectly within legal bounds, yet it had accomplished far more than its practical purpose. It had exposed Karen's limitations, revealed the flaws in the HOA's enforcement, and reminded the neighborhood that rules could be followed with ingenuity and cleverness. And as the sun set over Willow Creek, a subtle tension lingered in the air, signaling that this was only the beginning of a battle that would soon escalate further. The morning after the fence expansion, Willow Creek was buzzing with quiet excitement. Neighbors whispered behind hedges, exchanged knowing glances from driveways, and subtly gawked at the now larger, perfectly legal fence that had shifted the neighborhood's dynamics in a single day. For some, it was entertaining. For others, it was shocking. But one person's fury eclipsed everything else. Karen Whitmore. Her obsession had escalated overnight, and now she was determined to reclaim control, convinced that her relentless oversight alone could reverse the homeowner's audacious move. Karen spent the morning pacing her yard, calculating strategies, remeasuring the newly expanded fence through binoculars, and scribbling notes furiously in her oversized leather notebook. In her mind, she had already imagined the HOA siding with her, issuing fines, and forcing the fence's removal. Yet each rule she reviewed, each clause she scrutinized, failed to support her outrage. The homeowner had executed the expansion flawlessly within legal limits. The precision was infuriating. Every post, every board, every hinge was in complete compliance with HOA regulations, leaving Karen powerless under the very rules she had sworn to enforce. Her attempts to mobilize the HOA were immediate. She submitted formal complaints, demanded an emergency board meeting, and contacted every board member personally. Emails piled up, letters were hand-delivered, and phone calls incessantly reminded the HOA of the violation. But the board, a timid group of neighbors long accustomed to Karen's dramatics, hesitated. They were acutely aware that the homeowner had followed every legal guideline to the letter. Any punitive action against the fence would risk legal consequences for the HOA and open a floodgate of complaints from other residents who had grown wary of Karen's relentless campaigns. Meanwhile, the homeowner observed the chaos with measured detachment. Each of Karen's frantic movements was anticipated. Every board meeting request, every email complaint, every call to the HOA was factored into a larger strategy. The homeowner's calm confidence was deliberate, a quiet demonstration of mastery over both the rules and the neighborhood theater. They understood one undeniable truth. Karen could complain, but she could not bend the law to her will. The entire conflict had shifted from a battle over a fence to a subtle power struggle, with compliance and clever planning on one side and obsessive control on the other. As the hours passed, Karen grew increasingly desperate. She began suggesting arbitrary changes to the fence, demanding minor adjustments that weren't actually required by any rules. She claimed the fence interfered with sightlines and violated the neighborhood's visual flow, but her arguments lacked legal weight. The HOA board, unwilling to create liability for themselves, ignored the demands or offered ambiguous responses that satisfied neither Karen nor the homeowners. Every suggestion Karen made was skillfully neutralized by the homeowner's careful adherence to every regulation. It was a game of precision. Karen's fury versus legality, obsession versus strategy. Not satisfied with email complaints alone, Karen escalated her tactics further. She began organizing neighborhood inspections, walking past the fence at different times of day, and taking photographs from every conceivable angle. She spoke to neighbors, attempting to rally support, framing the fence as a dangerous precedent that could undermine community values. But the homeowner had anticipated this as well. The fence, while strategically expanded, remained perfectly polite in appearance, an aesthetic compromise that satisfied neighbors visually while still maximizing the homeowner's leverage. Each photograph Karen took highlighted not an infraction, but the homeowner's meticulous compliance, making her efforts both futile and embarrassing. The tension in the neighborhood grew. Other residents watched the drama unfold with a mix of amusement and awe. Whispers spread across lawns and driveways. Karen, furious as ever, confronting the invisible wall of legal correctness. The homeowner, meanwhile, became a silent legend, their calculated moves demonstrating the power of knowledge and patience over mere authority. What had begun as a simple backyard fence had transformed into a public spectacle of strategy and restraint, turning Karen's obsession against her own perceived authority. By midweek, the homeowner decided to take the next step. Using the legal boundaries to their advantage, they expanded the fence slightly more, adding decorative posts and subtle embellishments that remained fully compliant with HOA rules. Each addition was carefully designed to maximize visibility, emphasizing both functionality and aesthetic appeal. To any casual observer, it was a beautiful enhancement, but to Karen, it was a provocative act of defiance. A deliberate reminder that rules, when understood correctly, could be used as a shield against petty tyranny. Karen's reaction was instantaneous. She appeared at the homeowner's property unannounced, attempting to measure, photograph, and intimidate in person. But every action she took highlighted her impotence. The homeowner calmly documented each interaction, demonstrating compliance at every turn. Her frustration was palpable. Her voice, filled with indignation, was directed at nothing more than a fence that had never violated any rule. The irony was delicious. Her obsession had created the perfect stage for the homeowner's strategy, and every movement she made only validated the homeowner's careful planning. As the week drew to a close, the HOA was forced into inaction. The homeowner's legal adherence was airtight, leaving Karen without recourse. Her emails, her inspections, her complaints, they all amounted to little more than spectacle. The neighborhood had witnessed a lesson in patience, strategy, and the careful manipulation of rules. It was clear that Karen's influence had limits, and that knowledge could be more powerful than authority when wielded with precision. Yet Karen was not defeated. Her fury simmered, her obsession sharpened. The homeowner, fully aware that the next escalation would come, continued to plan quietly. The fence, now both a practical boundary and a symbol of legal mastery, stood tall and unyielding. The stage was set for the next chapter of this suburban saga, one in which Karen's desperation would collide with the homeowner's ingenuity in a battle that would escalate beyond emails and photographs. By the time the weekend arrived, Willow Creek was on edge. The saga of the fence had consumed the neighborhood's attention entirely. Gossip spread through text messages, casual conversations, and hurried glances over hedges. The homeowner had turned a simple backyard addition into a spectacle, and Karen Whitmore had become a figure of obsession, both feared and mocked. Yet Karen herself remained furious, convinced that one last maneuver would force the homeowner to comply or remove the fence entirely. Karen's strategy had escalated to its peak. She had spoken to every HOA board member multiple times, insisting on an official ruling. She had drafted letters, photos, and even diagrams, each illustrating her view of the violation with dramatic urgency. She had spoken to neighbors, attempting to rally support, portraying the fence as a danger to property values and the neighborhood's pristine aesthetic. But despite all her efforts, she faced an inconvenient reality. The homeowner had adhered perfectly to every rule, clause, and exception in the HOA's guidelines. Every move she made exposed her frustration, while simultaneously highlighting the homeowner's careful planning and understanding of the law. The homeowner had been preparing silently for the final act. Weeks of careful research, measurements, and observation had led to a bold, audacious plan that would not only comply with the law but assert control over the situation in a way Karen could neither counter nor ignore. Using every foot of the property line legally available, the homeowner began the expansion. This time, the additions were not subtle. Posts were placed at the maximum allowable boundary, creating a striking visual impact. Decorative features were incorporated, an elegant lattice, climbing plants, and accent lighting that drew attention while remaining entirely compliant with HOA rules. The fence became not just a boundary, but a statement, a blend of functionality, artistry, and legal strategy designed to make Karen's obsession appear absurd. As neighbors watched, the homeowner's plan unfolded like a masterclass in patience and precision. Every new section, every addition, adhered to the exact measurements dictated by law, leaving no room for the HOA to challenge it. Yet the visual transformation was undeniable. The fence now extended further than anyone expected, creating a bold, commanding presence in the yard. Its beauty, combined with its legality, turned Karen's complaints into a spectacle. The very object of her obsession had become untouchable, a public demonstration of what happens when rules are followed intelligently rather than blindly obeyed. Karen arrived later that day, armed with her notebook, camera, and a fury that had been simmering for weeks. She circled the property, measuring, photographing, and inspecting every detail. But no matter what she tried, every post, every board, every decoration was perfectly within legal limits. Every attempt to intimidate or enforce her will failed. Her frustration became increasingly visible, drawing subtle glances from neighbors who had gathered discreetly, some hiding smiles, others openly observing. What had started as a minor complaint had evolved into a neighborhood-wide demonstration of clever defiance versus petty obsession. The HOA, caught between Karen's relentless demands and the homeowner's flawless legal compliance, could do nothing. Any action against the fence would violate their own rules, creating liability and potential backlash. The board, once anxious to appease Karen, was now forced into quiet inaction. Karen's authority over the situation had evaporated completely. What remained was the homeowner's triumph. A perfectly legal, audacious expansion that publicly exposed the absurdity of the complaints while remaining entirely compliant with every rule the HOA had ever enacted. By the following morning, the neighborhood had fully absorbed the spectacle. Conversations revolved around the homeowner's strategy, Karen's futile fury, and the clever ways rules had been used to protect personal property while frustrating the most obsessive HOA enforcer in Willow Creek history. The homeowner remained calm, almost invisible, quietly enjoying the results of weeks of patience, research, and strategic planning. The fence, now complete, stood tall, elegant, and unassailable. A monument to clever defiance and the power of knowledge over petty authority. Karen, humiliated and powerless, was left to simmer in her own obsession. Her notes, photographs, and complaints amounted to nothing. The homeowner had followed the law with such precision that every attempt to intervene became both illegal and absurd. For the first time in her tenure as neighborhood watchdog, Karen was forced to retreat, leaving the homeowner in quiet victory. The spectacle had achieved more than just compliance. It had exposed the limitations of obsessive control, demonstrated the effectiveness of legal mastery, and entertained the entire neighborhood in a way that would be retold for years. By the end of the week, life in Willow Creek returned to a semblance of normalcy. The fence stood untouched, admired secretly by some neighbors and openly mocked by others. Karen had retreated to her routines, plotting her next opportunity to assert control, But the lesson of the fence lingered. The homeowner's audacious, legally impeccable strategy had reshaped the dynamics of the neighborhood. Knowledge, patience, and careful planning had triumphed over petty obsession. In the end, the homeowner had not only protected their property, but had created a spectacle that highlighted the absurdity of overzealous HOA enforcement. Karen's rage had become a cautionary tale, and the neighborhood had learned an unspoken lesson. Authority could be challenged, rules could be leveraged creatively, and sometimes the quietest, most calculated moves produced the loudest victories. The fence remained, a silent testament to strategy, legality, and the unspoken power of clever planning. Karen had been bested, the HOA rendered powerless, and Willow Creek would never forget the day when a simple backyard addition turned into the most audacious neighborhood spectacle of all time.